major shift in global trade is unfolding. China has opened a direct Arctic shipping route to Europe, cutting travel time in half and placing Beijing one step ahead in the race for control of international commerce.
For more than a century, the world leaned on the same cramped canals to move almost everything we buy. Then China switched on a new lane through the Arctic, shorter, colder, and far more disruptive than anyone expected.
The new Arctic routing will be 40% faster. It will provide less congestion with fewer vessels operating and has lower emissions and fuel use due to reduced fuel consumption and carbon output.
And now that single route is starting to pull power away from the old trade giants. China's new Arctic shortcut comes to life. Most ship tracking maps look the same day after day. Lines curve out of eastern China, dive down past India, squeeze through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, and then fan out toward Europe. In the autumn of 2025, people watching those maps started to notice one line doing something completely different. A ship icon labeled Istanbul Bridge left the busy coast near Ningbo and Zhoushan and then climbed north, skipping the usual choke points. Instead of aiming for the Red Sea, it slid over the top of Russia, crossed the Arctic Ocean, and only then dropped back down toward Britain. That ship, run by the Chinese operator Sea Legend, was not cruising for show. It carried close to 5,000 standard containers filled with things European buyers wanted before the holiday season. It left Ningbo Zhoushan in late September and was due to reach Felixstowe, Britain's biggest container port, in about 18 to 20 days. A normal southern route would have taken roughly 40 days through the Suez Canal and close to 50 days around the Cape of Good Hope, while even the fast China-Europe freight trains usually take about 25 days. This single Arctic trip cut the calendar almost in half. This was not a one-off event. Ningbo Zhoushan Port announced the launch of the world's first China-Europe Arctic Express route, a service running from Chinese ports like Qingdao and Ningbo to Felixstowe, with onward stops in Rotterdam, Hamburg, and Gdansk. Sea Legend and local customs officers talked about regular seasonal sailings, quicker restocking for European stores, and lower storage costs because exporters no longer had to ship goods 6 or 7 weeks in advance. In simple terms, China had just switched on a new lane in its trade map and told customers that this Arctic shortcut was open for business. To see how big a break that is from the old pattern, it helps to roll the story back more than 10 years. In the summer of 2013, China's giant state shipping firm COSCO sent a vessel called Yongsheng from ports near Shanghai and Dalian to Rotterdam using the same high-latitude corridor. Instead of dropping south toward the Strait of Malacca and Suez, the ship hugged Russia's Arctic coast. The Arctic leg cut the distance by a few thousand miles and saved around 1 to 2 weeks compared with a normal southern voyage. At the time, reporters and many shipping experts treated the voyage as a curiosity, something halfway between a commercial trial and a science experiment. Over the next few summers, only a few Chinese-flagged ships tried the route on carefully planned test runs. Russian pilots rode with them, and every trip meant watching the ice, the insurance rules, and the fees. It was progress, but still nowhere near a steady schedule anyone could rely on. The practical lesson from those experiments was that the route could work, but only inside a narrow window and only with help from Russian authorities. The first clear sign that Beijing wanted more than scattered tests came in January of 2018, when the government released its official Arctic policy document. In that document, China described itself as a near-Arctic state and said it hoped to work with other countries to build a polar Silk Road by developing Arctic shipping routes. The text encouraged Chinese businesses to join Arctic infrastructure projects and to run trial voyages along northern sea routes so they could gradually become normal commercial lines. On the water, however, most of the real traffic still came from Russian oil, gas, and coal projects, while the dream of a regular China-Europe lane through the Arctic remained on paper. To understand what has changed since, you need a simple picture of the route itself. The Northern Sea Route runs along Russia's Arctic shore, starting near the Kara Sea east of Norway's North Cape, then bending past the Laptov and East Siberian Seas, and finally reaching the narrow Bering Strait between Russia and Alaska. Russian law treats most of this belt as a special coastal zone. Foreign ships that want to pass through have to request permission, follow set lanes, and accept Russian rules on pilots and traffic. The one thing that makes this shortcut usable at all is the way the Arctic climate has changed in recent decades. Satellite records since the late 1970s show that the amount of sea ice left at the end of summer has dropped by about half. September ice alone has been shrinking at roughly 12% per decade, and the Arctic is warming about 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. That has not turned the Arctic Ocean into a mild sea, but it has opened a late summer and early autumn window when large stretches of the northern sea route are thinly iced or even ice-free. Studies that track navigation days now show longer sailing seasons than before. They also suggest that ships built for cold conditions may gain even more days at sea as the region keeps warming. Russian and Chinese planners see this as proof that the route can be folded into real supply chains instead of feeling like a gamble every year. Traffic along the northern sea route shows how fast it has shifted from a trial run to something closer to routine. Official records say cargo volumes were only about 4 million tons in the early 2010s, climbed to almost 20 million tons by 2018, passed 32 million tons by 2020, and reached roughly 37.9 million tons in 2024. Inside that growth, the biggest jump is in transit freight that actually moves from one ocean basin to another. In 2024, it passed 3 million tons and hit 92 voyages. Rosatom, the Russian state company that runs the route, says Chinese firms are now buying or chartering ships built for Arctic container trips, and the number of these voyages doubled between 2023 and 2024. Those quiet numbers set the stage for the bigger move that put Istanbul Bridge in the spotlight. Behind the scenes, Beijing and Moscow were putting a political frame around this new trade lane. In October of 2025, Russian and Chinese officials met in Harbin under their joint Northern Sea Route Cooperation Group and signed off on a new action plan and roadmap for the corridor. They talked about building a sustainable transport corridor, improving logistics, and supporting major projects linked to the route. In simple terms, both governments now see this Arctic lane as part of their long-term trade and energy system, not just a backup route when trouble flares in the south. A ship moving across the roof of the world barely surprises anyone now. The harder question is what kind of machinery, ports, and rules are needed to keep that ship moving safely through ice and darkness year after year? What it really takes to sail China's new Arctic path. For China's new Arctic trade route to actually work, one huge ship has to lead the way, literally. It's called an icebreaker. An icebreaker is a super-strong ship with a thick steel hull and massive engines, built to smash through sea ice and clear a safe path so regular cargo ships can follow behind it. And nothing about this trip is simple. Before any ship even gets close to these waters, the owner has to get Russia's permission. The Northern Sea Route Administration, a Russian office set up just for this job, checks every ship that wants to use this lane along the far north coast. Companies must send in papers that show how strong the ship's hull is, what kind of ice class it has, what engines it uses, and what safety gear and crew training it has for cold water. They also have to submit a detailed plan that says when they want to enter, which stretch of coast they will follow, and where they plan to exit. This process can take months. Officials look at ice charts, weather forecasts, and the ship's abilities before they decide whether to grant a permit. If they say yes, they do not simply say, "Go ahead and sail." They assign an ice pilot, a person with special training for ice waters who comes on board to advise the captain on speed and course in the Arctic zone. They also tell the ship which icebreaker it will follow and which checkpoints it must report to along the way. In other words, this is not a free sea lane where anyone can just show up. It is a managed corridor that works only because a state machine sits over it and controls who moves, when they move, and how they move. That state machine rests on one big fact: Russia controls the world's strongest icebreaker fleet. Recent tallies count roughly 41 icebreakers in service under the Russian flag, with about 34 running on diesel engines and 7 powered by nuclear reactors. Several more are under construction. Nuclear icebreakers are especially important here. Instead of burning heavy fuel oil, they carry compact reactors that can run for years without refueling, which means they can push through ice for long trips without needing to stop. These ships are not small. The newest nuclear icebreakers in the Arktika class are more than 500 feet long and weigh tens of thousands of tons. They can push at a steady speed through ice several feet thick and have strong bows that are shaped to ride up onto the ice and crush it from above. When they are on duty, they move ahead of a convoy of merchant ships. Radar and spotters look for ridges and thick patches. The icebreaker backs up, rams forward, and does it again and again until a narrow, dark strip of open water appears, just wide enough for the ship behind to follow single file. Behind these ships lies a line of Arctic ports that turn ice-breaking strength into steady cargo traffic. One of the most important is Sabetta, a port carved into the frozen coast of the Yamal Peninsula. Next to Sabetta stands the Yamal Liquefied Natural Gas Plant, often called Yamal LNG. Liquefied natural gas, or LNG, is natural gas that has been cooled down until it becomes a liquid. In that form, it takes up far less space, so tankers can carry large amounts across the sea. Yamal LNG draws gas from a huge field under the tundra and chills it into liquid right at the shore. When Yamal LNG first loaded a ship in late 2017, many people doubted it could run well in such harsh conditions. By the end of just 1 year of full operation, the plant had reached its design capacity of about 16.5 million tons of liquefied gas per year across 3 main production units, known as trains. A fourth, smaller unit later pushed total capacity close to 17.5 million tons per year. In 2024, the terminal shipped around 21 million tons of liquefied gas in roughly 287 tanker loads, setting a new record for output from this one frozen port. That flow does not all go one way. Some cargoes move west toward Europe once they leave the ice. Others head east through the Arctic window toward Asia when ice conditions allow. Recent tracking for the summer of 2025, for example, shows more than 50 shipments leaving Yamal over 3 months, with several cargoes going straight to China, South Korea, and Taiwan, and others feeding European buyers. Just across the bay from Yamal on the Gaidin Peninsula, Russia's next big project, Arctic LNG 2, was designed around the same idea. It aims for almost 20 million tons of liquefied gas per year when fully built, with cargoes moving first to Russian transshipment points and then on to Asia. Many of those cargoes now end up at China's Beihai terminal in the south, tying Chinese coastal energy hubs directly to Arctic gas fields. The picture is clear. Chinese buyers already rely on Arctic gas that moves along this northern lane. All of this only works because the ships that carry the gas are almost as tough as the icebreakers that guide them. Yamal LNG and Arctic LNG 2 use a special group of tankers known as ARC-7 carriers. These are massive ships built with double hulls and thick steel plating. Their bows are shaped for normal ocean sailing, but their sterns are built like icebreakers. In open water, they sail forward like any other tanker. When they hit thick ice, they turn around and move backwards, letting the heavy stern crush and ride up over the ice. Design rules say these ARC-7 tankers can move on their own in close-packed ice more than 4 feet thick and can follow behind an icebreaker in even thicker ridges. They have powerful engines and propellers that can keep them going through frozen seas. In sea trials, the lead ship in the class, Christophe de Margerie, kept a steady pace of about 8 miles per hour while moving through ice about 5 feet thick, a speed that normal ships cannot even dream of in those waters. These tankers follow a simple annual rhythm. In the warmer months, when ice is thinner, they sail east from Yamal along the northern sea route to Asia, bringing liquefied gas directly to markets in China and its neighbors. In winter, when the ice along the northern coast becomes too thick, they often sail west to Europe instead, linking Yamal to ports with storage tanks, and then sending the gas onward from there. China is not just a customer at the far end of these routes. It is slowly building its own tools to operate in polar waters. The older Chinese polar ship Shuilong, or Snow Dragon, started life as a Soviet-built cargo icebreaker before China converted it into a research and supply vessel in the 1990s. For years, it was China's only polar ship and handled supply runs to both Arctic and Antarctic stations. In late 2019, China put a second polar ship into service, called Zheilong 2. This is the first polar research icebreaker built in Chinese shipyards. It is about 400 feet long and a little over 70 feet wide, with a special hull and engines that let it push through ice roughly 5 feet thick while still moving at a slow, steady pace. Unlike many older icebreakers, it can break ice both moving forward and moving backward, which makes it flexible in tight conditions. Over the past few seasons, Shuilong 2 has worked in summer sea ice north of Alaska and along parts of the northern sea route, giving Chinese crews direct experience in the same waters their cargo will later cross. China is not stopping with 2 polar ships. Plans and early construction work point to at least 1 more polar vessel and a larger heavy icebreaker design that would go beyond Zheilong 2 in power. These future ships will be able to house around 180 people and carry helicopters. This would give Chinese teams more reach for both science and practical tasks like scouting ice or helping ships in trouble. On land, China has planted a permanent flag in the high Arctic through its Yellow River Station. This small research base sits at Ny-Ålesund in the Svalbard Islands, about 760 miles from the North Pole. It opened in 2004 and has since hosted more than 250 research projects and more than 660 visiting scientists. The work there focuses on things like glaciers, sea life, and the upper atmosphere, but it also gives China something very practical: long-term data on ice, weather, and ocean conditions, plus a steady presence and network among Arctic scientists. Once you see how much machinery and quiet coordination it takes just to move these ships through broken ice, the next question almost asks itself: what kind of impact does this frozen shortcut have on the older sea lanes and ports that the world has relied on for so long? Why this Arctic shortcut shakes the global shipping map. Most people never think about it, but almost everything in a house, a shop, or a phone in someone's hands spends part of its life squeezed through just a few narrow sea lanes. These are the shipping shortcuts that pull Asian factories and Western buyers together. If one of these lanes jams, the whole system feels it in a matter of days. That is why even a small working Arctic shortcut instantly matters for global power, money, and who gets to call the shots on world trade. The clearest symbol of this old map is the Suez Canal. It cuts through Egypt and links the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, giving ships a straight shot between Europe and Asia without going around Africa. Suez carries between 12 and 15% of all global trade by volume and about 30% of all container traffic, with more than $1 trillion in goods passing through every year. This is not a side road. It is one of the main valves of the world economy, and the tolls ships pay are one of Egypt's biggest sources of hard currency. On the other side of the world sits the Panama Canal. It slices across Central America and links the Atlantic and Pacific. Panama handles about 5% of all world trade and roughly 40% of all container traffic that links the United States to the rest of the world. Every year, cargo worth around $270 billion moves through its channels for American trade alone. Many shipping lines, port plans, and rail links on the east and west coasts of the Americas are built around the assumption that this canal will keep working smoothly. Over decades, ports and routes have grown around these 2 canals like branches around a tree trunk. In Europe, container hubs in the Mediterranean and North Sea stand where Suez traffic makes sense to stop and split cargo. In the Middle East and the Red Sea, terminals were built and expanded because almost every box from East Asia to Europe passes that way. In the Americas, large East Coast ports count on steady flows through Panama, while some West Coast ports depend on cargo that skips the canal and goes by rail or truck instead. This pattern makes the system efficient, but also very vulnerable when one link fails. The last 2 years have shown how fragile this setup really is. In late 2023, Yemen's Houthi movement began attacking ships in the Red Sea. That narrow sea is the southern approach to Suez. Within weeks, many of the world's biggest container lines stopped sending their ships through that corridor and rerouted them around the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of Africa. In the first months of 2024, the volume of trade passing through Suez dropped by about half compared with a year earlier, and by mid-2024, the tonnage transiting the canal was down by about 70%. Those ships went the long way around Africa. The capacity diverted around the Cape of Good Hope jumped by almost 90%. A typical container trip from a major Chinese port like Shenzhen to Rotterdam grew from about 10,000 nautical miles and roughly 31 days via Suez to about 13,000 nautical miles and roughly 41 days via the Cape. That is around an extra week and a half at sea for every voyage, more fuel burned, more crew time, and higher freight rates. Container prices on some Asia-Europe routes more than doubled for a while as the system struggled with longer detours and fewer ships available at any moment. For Egypt, the cost was painful. In early 2025, Egypt's president said the country was losing about $800 million in Suez Canal revenue every month because of the Red Sea crisis. This is money Egypt depends on to pay for imports and to service its debts. When it suddenly drops, the currency, government budget, and job market all feel the shock. Panama has its own version of this problem, and it comes from the sky rather than missiles. In 2023 and early 2024, a strong drought cut water levels in the lakes that feed the canal's locks. To keep ships moving at all, the Canal Authority had to slash daily transit slots and limit the size and draft of vessels. At the start of 2024, transits through Panama were down by almost half compared with earlier peaks, and daily slots fell from more than 30 ships to the mid-teens. That bottleneck forced some carriers to reroute, adjust schedules, and accept delays, which raised costs for shippers using United States East Coast ports and Latin American trade. Put all of this together, and one thing becomes obvious. The world has been running a 21st century economy on a map drawn for the 19th and early 20th century. A handful of canals and passages carry huge shares of trade. When trouble hits one of them, there are only two choices: go the long way around or wait in line. In this context, an Arctic lane that can cut big chunks off the distance between Northern Europe and East Asia stops looking like a side story and starts looking like a new lever in the global system. Economists in Europe say that when the ice is soft enough, this northern sea route can cut the distance and travel time between Northeast Asia and Northwest Europe by about 1/3 compared with the old routes. A common example is the trip from Murmansk in Russia to Yokohama in Japan. If a ship goes through the Suez Canal, the journey is about 12,840 nautical miles. If it goes along the Arctic coast, it is only about 5,770 nautical miles. That is a cut of roughly 30 to 40% in both distance and sailing time. Other route checks show the same pattern. For example, the trip from Ningbo in eastern China to Rotterdam in the Netherlands is about 10,600 miles through Suez, but only around 7,800 miles along the Northern Sea route. In simple terms, a ship that might need about 4 to 5 weeks to go from East Asia to Northern Europe on the usual route can do the main Arctic stretch in a little over 2 weeks during the open water season. If this becomes reliable, ship owners can try to do one extra round trip each year with the same ship, or they can use fewer ships to keep a weekly service running between Asia and the North Sea. This is where the threat to the old map becomes clear. Economists have asked what would happen if the Arctic were easy to use all year round. Even in that best case, they think the Northern Sea route might carry only about 5% of world trade by value. That sounds small, but most of that 5% would come from routes that now use the Suez Canal and, to a lesser degree, the Panama Canal, and long paths around the south. In their models, up to about 2/3 of the traffic that would normally go the long Southern Sea route between parts of Europe and Asia would switch to the north instead. So a small share of total trade would still be a very large share of the most profitable, time-critical cargo that some canals and ports depend on. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.